All right, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked, and we are stoked that you are joining us today, Friday. For those of you that are joining us live on YouTube, we've been doing this where we're going live on YouTube Friday mornings at 10, and unless life happens, and last week life happened for us, and which was super cool. And we'll actually get a chance to talk about that. Last week, Phil was off doing some smart stuff with his classes and everything. He's working on his doctorate. And so it goes actually to play into what we've been talking about. New Wine Uncorked is about uncorking the possibilities of who we are as beings created in the image of God. And New Wine Skins is about engaging culture from the standpoint of a Christ-centered, spirit-led movement, a reality that is centered in Christ. And so our conversations these last few weeks, in fact, over this last year, I don't even know if people remember, but one of the first conversations that we had, and I don't even know if it was the three of us, it might have been Phil and I, but we were talking about Imago Dei, the image of God. And a couple of weeks ago when we met last time for New Wine Uncorked, we were talking about this into the margins, Jesus in the margins, which is quite pertinent now because things are opening up. And for those who are here up in the Northwest, in Southwest of Canada, you see this opening up is coming in the midst of this extreme heat right now. And so New Wine Uncorked wants to figure out ways in which the church can engage, but understanding what we have surrounding us. And so this weekend, to bring people outside to engage would be disastrous in the heat that we could possibly experience up here in the Northwest. And so the church has to understand its geography, its location, its setting, its timing. And so today we want to talk about this, creating space for the church to step into, for us to engage culture. But what are we creating space for? Might it be the time where people are talking about rushing into getting back to normal, that the church actually can step in, create space for us to slow down, for us to, we had a year and a half where people were forced into a slowdown, but might it be the case where for the church to engage culture at the level that Jesus wants us to, we actually have to actually detox the hurry. We had this hurry and this rush into what life was all about. And now coming out of the pandemic, we talk about this, post-pandemic age, as if the COVID is behind us. And so we want to continue this discussion. And I don't know where you're at, Tony, and where you're at, Phil, with the church is doing, but this idea of pushing back, we talked about this 2 weeks ago, getting back to normal. The concern, though, is it was normal, though, too fast-paced. Is the way in which we live our lives today such a hurried pace that we don't even have the opportunity to see the person in front of us? And then when we have pandemics, or like this weekend that we're going to experience where it's extreme heat, where we're forced back into relational space, that we then don't know each other because we haven't been taught how to relationally be with each other. It's always about doing. And so we rush around. And then when we get caught in these moments where we have to actually stop and be with each other, we don't know who each other is. So as we continue to push into opening up and trying to move into life, whether you want to call it post or amid the COVID-19, how does the church, though, create space for us to actually see the person in front of us, not to do, which is great. Serving one another and loving each other is exceptionally important. But how do we be the church, creating space for us to be so as to love on one another, but not to hurry past each other? In this push to open up, how can we as the church, though, get a routine to where now we can say, hey, we want to move at his pace, but we don't want to continue to hurry past what's in front of us. How does the church do that, though, in a fast-paced culture like this?
There's a couple of ways I think we can look at it, and I'm sure, Tony, you'll have some others as well. But first off, with the job that I currently have, with the place I'm working, it's been pretty cool. We do weekly church services with the guys, so those are in person. At times, we'll bring in speakers to come and share with the brothers. We do a weekly chapel service where we have volunteers come and actually spend time with the guys there too. And this last week it's been really good. So along with the opening up, we've actually had more volunteers coming in and spending time with our men. So it's been a good time. But the pace of our space is, about getting to know one another. And so we do have a space where, yeah, you're not coming to volunteer. Your first time coming to volunteer, you're not going to do anything. You're going to come and you're going to sit and experience, and you're going to watch. And usually for your first little while of doing that, this is what you're going to do. You come and just sit and watch. So it's created some space to be able for these guys to meet people. And I'm wondering, yeah, how much of our churches will be doing that. I believe that many of the churches have, they understand that. They understand to some degree that when we get back as we get back together, people are going to be a little nervous, albeit at the same time they're anxious that we haven't been able to meet, and so many people that you miss and the like. But be creating some spaces. I'm a part of a church plant as well, and one of the things we've been doing is having some consistent, of course, Zoom conversations and prayer meetings and the like. And some of our getting together has been just in parks during the middle of the week to kind of get to know our neighborhood because we're new to the neighborhood, but then also get to know one another. Because a guy like me, I haven't been able to roll into church on Sunday, so getting to know some of the people through our church. So it's given us some space to get to know one another, and it kind of slows that pace down. At the same token, thinking of just being a part of New Wine. And one of the things we've talked about for a while is the being driven church versus a purpose driven church. Talked about that a long time ago. I don't know when the more recent time we've had a conversation like that, but understanding what the church is about and understanding that this is what we need to be in the world and then people around us should be something that prompts us to slow down, to make sure that we have that relational connection with people rather than getting back to doing. And as we've talked about over the past few months, every time we talk about getting back to normal, the refrain behind that is there is no normal. normal normal wasn't right to begin with. So we're going to have to work on what does it mean to be relational in this new relationship that we have with one another. So yeah.
Yeah, in a previous conversation I had with a mentor, we were talking about how it seems that the academy or theology and philosophy always travels at a much more rapid pace than the church is able to keep up with. And an analogy for that could be research and development and manufacturing. Research and development always moves much quicker than manufacturing is able to build or construct. And so when we look at the church and what it looks like for us to gather or regather together, I think there's a theology that we've been developing during this season that had we been able to deploy it correctly or live into it, it would have soothed and eased some concerns, but we were more concerned about when we can get back together physically, when we can um, be together in the same space. So manufacturing couldn't catch up with the need, and therefore the theory far outpaced. And we see this also not just in COVID, but we see this in areas of justice. Oftentimes, to many people's chagrin, academics and scholars have really clean theories of ethics and morality and justice before we can ever deploy it or question it as practitioners. Um, but then that puts the church in an interesting dilemma, because what happens when other communities or sociological environments outpace the church in its understanding of justice? Um, in a conversation with another friend, we were talking about how uh, his wife works for the county, and they've been going through diversity, equity, and inclusion training, and there's a solid manual for it. But when we look at the church, where do we go? Galatians. I'm neither Jew nor Gentile. Like, and that's been the diversity, equity, inclusion training for the last 2,000 years. And that's not to say that it isn't sufficient. It's just to say that maybe our deployment of that theory is insufficient. So that's where my headspace is in regards to what does it mean for the church to reopen up.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you bring that up, Tony, with the creating space and there's no Jew or Gentile. And I think that the church does a disservice when we because like you said, that passage obviously involves inclusion, but it's so big, no Jew Gentile, that when you make it inclusive of everyone, sometimes you forget then each individual, because it becomes so about the group that we forget the individuality of each person that makes up that group. And so sometimes I think the church does this. And I've been thinking about this though, the church separating itself from these conversations of opening up, because we've got down in the South this the push, with the voting rights and this opening up and how we're going to redefine the country. I mean, the way in which we vote determines who's going to be in power, in office. And so we have that where the church is somewhat absent from that because it hasn't created space even in the public sphere, right? We just sit there and bicker. I was talking to another New Wine leader, and he was talking about how at their church, they've been discussing how there used to be this in between where we could step into the margins, but the two sides have become so polarized that gray area in between has become less, where there's nothing. It's either you're on the one side or on the other side, right? It's you're either super conservative when it comes to religion or you're super liberal. There's no in between anymore because the church, I feel like, has lost the desire to even create space, right? And so through COVID, while we've had this forced kind of time in the garden, Jesus would go away with the Father to spend time alone with the Father, and yet the time alone that we had to spend that could have been spent with the Father this last a year and a half or so, in isolation and really using it. I feel like so many of us, after a few days, got cabin fever and we were told, oh my gosh, we need to open up. And so then depending on what political party you're at, yes, during the Trump days, opening up was evil if you were on the left side, and now during the Biden days, opening up is the glory if you're on the, so politically, even we're all over the place. And the church, I feel like, follows suit, as opposed to the church stepping in and saying, hey, we need this space in order to dialogue. But first, to do this, we have to do it within our own space. The church, I feel like, is a parent who going and telling their kid, hey, you need to clean up your room. And then the kid looks at their parents' room and says, yeah, but your room is filthy. And they're like, yes, but I'm telling you, you need to, don't look here. Okay. Don't worry about my stuff. I'm telling you. And I feel like so often that's what the church does, is now we step into it. The culture is starting to open up again. People are interacting and the church is just right there saying, hey, you need to do this. We need to be loving towards one another. We need to worry about justice. We need to worry about relational inclusion. But then when people come into our building, into our groups, we have dissension within those that call themselves followers of Christ, whether it's, on the side of talking about, oh, is Metaxas and Driscoll and Graham, these guys, proper reading of the Bible, or Bonhoeffer. And so and I'm not saying that we can't dialogue, but I don't even know if what the church does anymore is dialogue. It seems like it's just nothing more than just bullhorns, these mega horns, where really the pulpit has legitimately become the bully pulpit. My concern is, as we continue to push into, oh, we got to get together, the church becomes exactly what Phil was saying, is that doing driven, that the purpose driven. It's so much about, well, what does the church do to show that we are successful? Because the American mindset is based on the marketplace, as opposed to, the public space for the Christian to step into and be okay to be publicly ridiculed, But when our church leaders aren't willing to do that, how can they then teach the rest of us what it looks like in the Jesus model to create space that's loving with grace, that does that Micah 6:8, right, Tony, that you're talking about with what is it? It's not one of the three, to love justice and mercy and, walk humbly. pick one of the three, it is to do justice, to do mercy, and to love, to walk humbly with your God. All three of them. Is the church doing that? Like, if we came to the church and said, are you Micah 6:8ing it? Are you following the Micah pattern? What justice would the church look at alongside, though, the mercy and, the creating space? That's humility. With humility, is the church doing this? I don't know, because I feel like so often the church follows suit with the politicians and the people who are leading society, as opposed to what Jesus did, walked within society, but was always saying, hey, there's a different way. Like, what part of the church is going to do that, though, in the midst of this, the talk? A lot of the language is inclusive, and a lot of the language continues to tell the church, though, you're not inclusive because you don't like sin. And so by saying you don't like sin, and maybe that's the church's fault, because the church has made sin to be about people as opposed to separation from God.
Matt, you said a lot there.
I know. I gotta just slow down sometimes,
Yes, sir. You're processing the thoughts. Let's back it up a little bit. So when we brought up the Galatians 3 passage that we're talking about, our egalitarian passage that go to often, I don't know if there's no consensus on that passage anyway. So to use that as one of the passages that we go to when we look for our understanding of race, it's correct. That's insufficient. The fact that we don't have consensus on it, and we don't have consensus on women leading in the church. We don't have a consensus on what it looks like for a church to be racially diverse or just full of differences. And what does it look like for those differences to worship together and clash together and serve together? So that becomes the bigger conversation, where you're correct, where the thought, what is the thing that you use? Our think tanks are moving faster than the manufacturing arm. When it comes to race, are we looking to those think tanks to look to progress our thoughts on these things? Are we looking for those think tanks to be the places where we learn and glean from those, or do we just ignore those, council culture, and put those to the side and say, well, those are the liberal arms that we as conservatives don't look at, if that's where you are as a conservative. But but where do we look to grow our thinking in these areas? And that's part of the thing. One of the things, Matt, you mentioned earlier that I'm doing a doctorate of ministry program. I'm at George Fox studying under Len Sweet, and one of his things is involving semiotics, and he takes images and metaphors and flips them and recasts the images and metaphors. And that's one of the big things that we've been doing a whole lot of, is just looking at different metaphors and looking at things within the text and seeing how it's recast within the text, but then also how do we recast it in our culture. And one of the things he looks at, we talk about the three sides of a coin. We talk about the head of the coin, the tail of the coin, but also the edge of the coin, as being a place for the church to sit, where we sit at an uncomfortable space, where we're saying both and to saints and sinners. We're saying an invitation to the sinner to join the party, but an invitation to the saint saying, what are you doing while you're in this party? And you're saying an uncomfortable space of grace and righteousness, and how weird it is to sit there. And that's a mind-blowing thing, at least for me off the bat, to consider. But then it's an uncomfortable place to live in, because you get yelled at from both sides, and taking this notion of understanding that both sides can see you as wrong is a tough place for anyone to be, church or otherwise, Christian or otherwise. Understanding that, yeah, I'm wrong about this, or learning that I'm wrong, or just at least taking flack from both sides, is a tough place to be. We want to find a good guy and lay with the good guys and be good, and then the bad guys point to them and say how wrong they are. But being at that sacred overlap, being at that place where we're standing on the edge of the coin, and we're able to give an invitation to both saint and sinner, to both righteousness and learn, and all these kind of things, are the places where we're going to have to be in. That's part of what we need to be, because this is what Jesus did. So, yep. So that's kind of where I'm at when I'm thinking about all this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Oh, sorry, Tony.
No.
I think it's interesting, this push, because we continue to come back to this push into who is the church highlighting? This saint, this sinner? Is it do we need a hero, kind of motif? And we get into this, especially following society's need for a hero. I need a hero, and all the songs that just go through my mind when I hear the word hero, and we're pushing into this. And yet the hero for the church is this dude who I think we so much wrestle with, because the American mindset is a victorious mindset. And if you go back into the annals of history, even theological history, the Christus Victor motif of the atonement and Christ being victorious over death and victorious over Satan. I think a lot of the times the church wants that victory model because everything in society is about winning, who wins, who loses. In faith, though, when we start talking about that language, I think the church in and of itself loses out when we talk about an us them mentality, it is hard though, because there is. I mean, the reality isn't there an us them mentality there? When you get to heaven, or whatever heaven is, or death happens, there will be clearly, at least this is what the Bible says, clearly a differentiation between those who are with Jesus in heaven doing the heaven's bidding, and those who are separated from Christ for all eternity, whether that's a place that is labeled hell or a relational truth. But the Bible clearly makes that. And so I think we sometimes live maybe subconsciously with the either or mentality. It's either this or it's that, because that is the end truth. I mean, you're either with Jesus or you're not. But living today, though, it's not that clear, right? We live in the kind of that weird gray area, that tension of the in-between. And I don't know if many of us know what to do with the in-between, because in-between seems like we oscillate back and forth. And isn't that the problem, though, with those of us who follow Jesus? Is each day I have part of my humanness that wants to choose me, wants to choose my pleasures. And if I'm honest with myself, and I think this is when we step into the realm of race or gender identity or equity, we don't deal with some of my own personal, so when I start talking to you two, if I haven't dealt with my own thoughts that go inward, like, hey, I want what I want, and I haven't dealt with my selfishness, then when we start talking about humility and justice and mercy, it's still coming through the lens of Matt Farlow. And so while I say I'm pushing for justice and equity for the three of us, the reality is I'm still going to try to push for a realm that has me on top of the two of you. You know what I'm saying? Hierarchically, even if I don't think I'm trying to, because I haven't dealt with that inner truth of, well, wait, what does it mean when it says the Galatians passage, there is no Jew or Gentile? What does that mean for me in relation to you, Phil, in relation to you, Tony? Also taking into account my humanness, that on this side of heaven, I still am pressing into perfection. I'm not there yet. How do we do that collectively, though, without losing that push to step into society? So the three of us are the church per se, because we follow Jesus, right? We understand. I don't want to say there's a secular world and other, but there are folks that are antagonistic, don't know, are numb to whatever the reason might be. They are not following Jesus. They have not given their hearts, has said yes to Jesus. How do we have that resoluteness to deal with what's going on within the church? Those folks that are not, they are Christian in name, but to step in and engage at a heart level, they haven't gotten there yet. So how do we deal with that? Recognizing the truth of who we are as a human, but then also setting each other up to where then when we're outside of our realm and we're engaging those who don't follow Jesus or not, that we can do that lovingly, though, but with, not confidence, because but the knowledge to know, hey, what we're doing is we're bringing them into the kingdom, which is an embracing of love, because we've created that space to where everyone doesn't have to be at this level spiritually. You know what I'm saying? Like, we so often put standards as, they're not good enough to be part of the church leadership or part of the church because they're not, I don't know what the standard is for the church, whether they're not at a certain place with their sexual identity. They're not at a certain place with their justice, what they understand justice as. They're not at a certain place what they understand the leadership of the church, And so we as the church are again, we oscillate back and forth to where we're confused because our leaders are pushing into leadership that is self-centered and not Jesus-centered, because Jesus's leadership is contentious with this world, not contentious with people, but with the mental. So again, like, what is the church's role today? Tony, with this moving forward kind of thing, that in between?
I mean, according to Balthazar, we could be hopeful.
Dare we hope that all are saved, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of I think the difficulty I have with trying to talk about both sides and like this in between is that I really don't. I don't know if, and maybe this is a generational thing, but I don't know if both sides is equitable, or if both sides' conversation is actually constructive. I wonder if it doesn't only further entrench us in our silos, because then we are uh, basically saying, like, I forfeit the right to talk constructively about our disagreements because we're choosing to disagree, or we're agreeing to disagree, or I'm flattening my disagreement with you by trying to rehabilitate what we do agree about, or because we agree on something, it rehabilitates what we actually do disagree about. Um, and so, like, pastorally, where I feel it is like with critical race theory. Nobody knows what critical race theory is, or at least the people who are talking about it don't know what it is. And the people who oppose it definitely don't know what it is. And they keep throwing labels on it that have nothing to do with critical race theory, as if critical race theory is the same as critical theory and the Frankfurt School. Like, there just is no, but that's par for the course, because there is no historicity. It's all revisionist according to critique. Um, and, and so, like, I find the church, and this goes back to research and development or manufacturing or theory and academics and practice. Like, it takes a long time for people to change. And so that's why theory is always advancing, because while a community or a people or a church may be incrementally changing and catching up to innovation, theory never stops innovating. Theory never stops theorizing. And so oftentimes that's destabilizing for practitioners, and practitioners lose control. And because change is uncomfortable, they'd rather just not lean into theory and not lean into change and become stagnant. Critical race theory is not something to be afraid of. It's not like it just has no ability to cause harm. It's people who enact the theory. If critical race theory is harmful, it's people who enact it. But at the same time, that's a very casual generalization, because there are theories that cause tremendous harm even without people enacting it. So everything is very complex and is never a one-to-one. And so I guess I'm tired of having conversations that really have like no relevance. They're like dated conversations. Like Paul talks about in Galatians, like Paul throughout the entirety of the letter, he's not attacking Judaism. He's not attacking people outside of the faith. He's attacking Messianic Jews who are proclaiming a false gospel. You must be circumcised in order to be saved. It's an in-house conversation. But so often the church would far rather attack people outside than rather do introspective in-house work. And so I don't know. I wonder if this isn't why the church has lost, the Western American church hasn't lost its witness, and younger millennials and Gen Z and Gen Alpha, they just could care less. They could care less because the church creates its own problems so that only it can answer. Like it baffles my mind with how much quote unquote genius we have. Maybe this is the ingenious part of it, is that we create a problem that only we can solve, and we're geniuses. That way we never become obsolete. But I have an angst that, man, we're missing out on so much because we're worried about things that really are so trivial.
And I hear you with a lot of that, and then especially the disappointment, the that angst that's there, because yeah, I mean, there's, in some regard, I mean, our society has in some way, and not every person that thinks this is wrong, but our society in some way, has taken God out of this very center of things. And the church has kind of done, I don't want to say the church has kind of done the same thing, but we've just said, okay, well, we'll take God and put him over here. And then we're like, well, fine. If you guys don't want him, well, we want him. We'll take him, put him over here. And we're not able to talk when it comes to things like justice, things like race, just things that every person deals with. We're not able to talk about those things with Christ as our center and understand through the scriptures how Christ would look at that, unless the Bible directly says something about it. We've lost the ability to, yeah, reframe what Paul's talking about to apply to the thing that's going on in our lives. And it's just a weakness in how we conservatives, right? We'll talk about Bible literacy and the like, right? And maybe that's knowing a bunch of verses, maybe that's knowing the story of the gospel. I don't know what that even means sometimes, but the ability to interpret the scriptures, recast the image to say, here's how this scripture applies here, outside of giving 5 or 6, 3 or 4 just esoteric pointless points about it, but that actually applies and are actually good and useful for how I live life today. Yeah, we lose that, and we've lost that, and the ability to talk to the culture as Christians with some moral authority. And part of it, there's probably there are several reasons that contribute to that. But the same token, when I talk about standing on the edge of the coin, I'm not talking about compromise. I'm not talking about finding middle ground. That's not where I'm going. Where I'm going is, I'm giving a critique to the sinner and calling out sin and their need for the gospel and demonstrating my need for the gospel as well. But at the same time, looking at my congregation, looking at the people that my brothers and sisters in Christ, and being able to be a critic to my brothers and sisters in Christ, and being able to say, hey, we're leaning into being Pharisees here. This is the prophetic word for us within the church, and not escaping both of those places, that we don't have to walk away from understanding what grace is, and we don't have to just fully accept what the other brothers and sisters in our faith are talking about. They're still our family, because we don't draw the line or put people in that circle. But we know what the text says, and we can look at our brothers and sisters and say, hey, here's where we're falling short. Here's what we need to lean into. Here's the spaces where we need to grow into. While at the same time looking at the world around us saying, hey, sin is still sin. And we all need to live in the grace of God. And this is how we're coming to the family of God. And living in both those worlds are the places where it, and in some regard, it is living in two worlds. But in other regards, we can disconnect from the places where, as you were talking about earlier, where there seems to be no middle ground. Like, oh, well, look, I'm just not going to be here to debate for the sake of debater's sake. I'm going to be here demonstrating God's love to people who needs it. And those people who need it are in the church and outside the church. So this is what we'll be about. So, yeah.
See, and I think it's interesting too, Phil, because we go, it's the gospel that saves, and we have these songs, and you even talk about it. The push, I think sometimes we would rather have the gospel, and this isn't what you're talking about. You're talking about Jesus because you said Jesus centered, but I think sometimes the churches want just the letter of the law as opposed to the one who is at the center of the law, so we point to behavior modification as opposed to Jesus, because Jesus kind of wrecks us when we start to say, oh, well, we want leadership. And one of the New Wine leaders, Ruben, he's a pastor at Imago, and we were talking about this, and he was telling me about the verse that he that the Lord had really spoken to him about from 2 Corinthians. And it really, I was like, yeah, see, this is what when people ask about new wine, what are they talking about this engagement of culture from a Christ-centered, spirit-led. And it really goes back to what you continue to hammer for the longest time, Tony. And what we've talked about is this theology of suffering, in the Christian, and not just the acknowledgement that you will be suffering, but the actual embracing of it. And Ruben was highlighting, we were talking about part of the New Wine curriculum that we're putting together, that we develop, and how we partner with churches. And he brought this verse up, I will gladly spend for you everything. This is 2 Corinthians 12:15. I will gladly spend for you everything I have and expend myself as well. And he says, this is what Paul says, if I love you more, will you love me less? Like, to over love the world. And I think this is what Bonhoeffer was getting into when he said, become more like the world than the world is. And this is what Karl Barth, the theologian, said when he's talking about having one hand in the newspaper, one hand in the Bible. Understanding, and Phil, you were saying this, it's like when I laugh when people talk about, oh, do you think that there could be other worlds, like there's other creations? I'm like, and if they're Christian, I'm like, dude, don't you feel like we have two worlds right now anyways? There's this world that doesn't know Jesus, and there's this world that does, and I live in between both of them, right? Because the Lord put on me a call that says, go and make disciples. There's no Christian who doesn't have that call on their life. So in our church this last weekend, one of the folks talking was trying to make this distinction between living and missional living, like for Christians who are living missionally. And I just stepped back and I said, see, she wasn't trying to make any comment on whether or not you should be or should not be missional living, but by saying that you either can choose to be missional or not choose to be missional, it insinuates that the life of the Christian doesn't have to be missional, and that's where I think that this is where the church is missing out on this creating space. Because I agree with you, Phil, in the sense of it is like we're in two worlds. We are. It's a kingdom. So however we want to language, there are two kingdoms, right? The kingdom of this world here on earth, and then there is the kingdom of heaven that Christ came to reveal fully to us. So what are we doing on a daily basis? And this is why I think that we miss out when we don't really press into, well, what does it mean when Jesus says for me to live? I mean, for Paul, when he says to me, for me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Are we willing to wrestle with the truth of that statement? Like, in the sense of, what lengths am I willing to go for me to live Christ today? This is a dude who, again, and Phil, you're planning a church, right? You're doing this, and your doctorate is going into the history of the Black church, looking at this, so you can see the turmoil and tension of when you truly are about Jesus and you don't meet the standards of society. What happens? Well, that's what happens to the history of the Black church, right? They were about Jesus and the culture, a gospel, but they didn't look the part, right? And they didn't meet the standards that were set up by society. So what happens? They're oppressed and ostracized. And isn't that what happened in the first century? Isn't that what happens throughout the course of the church history? Is the more the church is about Jesus and the gospel message, the more it is absolutely ravaged by culture, which is, that's the message of Jesus, is that you're going to be hated. How many church leaders, though, actually step into that and say, look, to be a Christian in today's culture is not about comfort and retirement and 401k and all of that? It really is like, could you imagine if every week you took your lump sum of value and you took 10% of that and gave it to God every week, how many people would be Christians? If every week you had to give a valuation of everything that you own and everything, and you took 10% of that every week and offered it to the Lord, like how many of us are willing to be that sacrificial to where we would say, like Paul, for very gladly, I spent everything of who I am and nothing less. And you didn't love me anymore and actually love me less. And that's okay, because I'm going to love you even more. Like how many Christians are that? How many churches are that resolved? Like on a daily basis, when you guys meet together, Phil, and stuff, like, aren't those the conversations that we have to have? Like, hey, look, the world's going to hate us, even though we're professing and living out. Are we living out the message of love? And what does that mean? Because it sounds ridiculous to tell someone, oh, by the way, if you love the world more than it loves you, it's going to hate you. That doesn't make sense. So how do we, though? New Wine talks about the intoxication and the scandal of Jesus. How do we make people understand that intoxication isn't a drunkenness unto passing out and being stupid? It's actually intoxication so as to relive, it's to be exalted. Like that's the intoxication that takes us beyond, so as to live heaven now. How is that message promoted by the leaders of the church today, as we open up, like in the midst of what we were talking about, this creating space? Like we can't just say to the world, oh, well, you need the gospel, because does the church know what that gospel message is?
Yeah, that becomes the biggest question, right? Do we, the last question where you ended, do we actually know what the gospel is? Do we live this amongst one another? This is part of why I always think of the church as the prime example for when we talk about racial reconciliation, when we talk about all those kind of things. The first question for a Christian should be, does this exist within the church that you're a part of? Does this exist amongst the Christians that you're a part of? If not, I don't feel like we have right to turn to the world and say, you all need to do X, Y, and Z, because we don't live out what we believe in our church. And it's one thing to believe it, and it's a whole nother thing to apply it and live it out. And that's the strain that we live in regularly. And that's part of what we need to encourage ourselves to live into. What does it mean to actually live out the gospel? What does it mean to over love the people around us? What does it mean to live in that generosity? Becomes just the issue, part of the issue as a church. We need to be having that insider conversation amongst ourselves, living into these things. So
Yeah, theologian Chris Green says that the wine of the Lord leads to sobriety. And so I think whatever we mean by the intoxication, it's not for drunkenness, but it's for um, a clear-headedness. We're intoxicated with the truth. It's for a clear-headedness. Um, and so I wonder. Yeah, the church always goes through cycles of trying to figure out if it has abandoned the gospel or if it has stayed faithful to the gospel. Um, and I wonder where we made it so complicated. I mean, it's not it's not simplistic, but it's also not overly complicated. And so, yeah, I would hope that I think for people who feel burdened and passionate to faithfully live out the gospel, that they no longer try to defend it in-house. Like there are just some people who've already made up their minds that everyone else but them and their family is going to heaven, or is going to hell, and their family is the frozen chosen. I mean, like whatever we want to call it. Like I don't want to strive for the approval of man anymore, and so when we keep talking about uh what the gospel is, it's like I think we know what the gospel is, and to continue to fight over what is the gospel only further entrenches us away from the world. Because if we don't know what the gospel is and the world doesn't know what the gospel is, then we're kind of up a creek. So I just, yeah, I'm sitting here very, very eager for everyone to get vaccinated so I don't have to wear a mask anymore. And then evangelism would be much easier.
Yeah. Well, and that goes to the case in point of what are we filling our, I mean, I know it sounds, you're right, Tony. Sometimes I think we make it too complicated. Like, it really comes down to, and this is what I love having theological discussions with my mom. You know, she's going to be 70 in the next couple of years. And really, when it comes down to it, her response sometimes is, you know what? I don't know. I just try not to make it complicated. And I love Jesus, you know, and it goes back to what Karl Barth said when, you know, he's asked in a conference, you know, seminar, what have you learned about all this? What's the Bible? And he said, you know, this I know, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. Like, sometimes we do complexify it for no apparent reason, you know. And it is important for the church, though, to be embracing of our reason, you know, because the faith is a rational truth, but it also then goes beyond, you know. And so we have to have that understanding of the faith seeking understanding. And that's what we're going to continue to dive into. You know, Immanuel Kant talked about thoughts without content are empty. Well, same thing with faith, right? Faith without thoughts, you know, that are rooted, though, and grounded in the gospel. Okay. Then they're blind. And so we want to continue to press into that. But what does that mean? What does that mean? The gospel message, you know, stepping into the gospel. And so this week we were talking about creating space. Well, when we create a gospel space, we have to understand what the gospel message is first. And so we're going to step into that next week and talk about when we talk about, oh, it's the gospel that saves, or we hear about the gospel, the good news. What exactly is so good about this good news? And what is the news in which we're talking about? And so we're inviting you again to join us once again. Get your friends, you know, like a watch party and all that kind of goodness. Friday mornings, you start out the weekend right. This is why we do it 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on the West Coast, because you know what? We want to start the weekend right. We want to start it off. And there's no better way to start anything than by talking and thinking and injecting Jesus into the mix. You know, it's going to wreck things, but in a good way. And we're stoked about doing that every week with you. So Phil, Tony, I'm Matt. This has been New Wine UnCorked. You know, every Friday you can join us trying to seek out the ways in which we uncork the potential of who we are as created beings, created in the image of a loving and relational God. So thank you so very much for joining us today. If you didn't get a chance to watch this whole broadcast, it'll be uploaded this weekend by Sunday. So just pay attention to go to YouTube / New Wineskins, or you can head on over to our Facebook page and hit like there. And so anytime things come up, whether it's a blog post by one of us or New Wine UnCorked, or we have other video series, New Wine Tastings and New Wine Table Talks, and then as well as the happenings that are going on in and through New Wineskins. You could go to our website, new-wineskins.org, to find out all the good things that are going on in and through New Wine. So again, on behalf of my friends and my colleagues, Phil and Tony and Matt, this has been New Wine UnCorked. Until next week, we'll see you on the flip side. Have a good one.